She threw my old passbook into the garbage bag like it was a piece of used tissue paper. I watched her do it. I did not say a word. I just stood at the kitchen door with a cup of tea going cold in my hand, and I let her throw away 38 years of my life without telling her what it really was. That is who I am. My name is Rashid Ahmed. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life, I have been the kind of man who stays quiet when it hurts the most. Not because I am weak, because I have always believed that silence, when used correctly, can say more than any argument ever could. That morning, standing in my own kitchen, watching my daughter clean out useless junk from my study drawer, I made a decision. I would not explain. I would not defend myself. I would let time do what I could not do with words. But let me take you back. Let me tell you how a father who built everything with his bare hands became, in his own house, a man treated like a burden. Let me tell you what happens when children forget where the roof over their heads actually came from. I was born in a small town outside Lahore, in a house with a tin roof that leaked every monsoon season. My father was a school teacher who earned barely enough to feed 6 children. I was the third. I remember, even as a boy of 10, standing outside the gates of a bank in our town, watching men in iron shirts walk in and out with leather briefcases and thinking to myself, one day I will walk through those doors not as a visitor, but as someone who belongs there. It took me 22 years of relentless work to make that dream real. I started as a junior clerk in a small regional bank branch, counting cash by hand, staying late every single night to learn everything the senior officers knew and more. I did not have connections. I did not have money. I had only one thing: patience, and the willingness to be underestimated while I quietly built something real. By the time I was 40, I had worked my way up to a senior manager position at one of the largest private banks in the country. But more importantly, along the way, I had learned something most people never learn: how money actually grows when you are patient with it, and how real wealth is never loud. Real wealth does not wear branded clothes or drive flashy cars. Real wealth sits quietly in property documents, small investments made decades ago, and accounts that nobody except you and your lawyer know about. I married my wife, Nasreen, when I was 26. She came from a modest family like mine, and she understood the value of hard-earned money in a way that few people do. We built our life brick by brick, literally. The house we live in now, I built it over 12 years, adding one room at a time whenever I had saved enough. We had 2 children. Our son, Bilal, and our daughter, Sanadat. Bilal was the golden child in everyone's eyes. Confident, loud, always the center of attention at family gatherings. He went into business early, some import-export trade that our relatives kept praising, though I noticed quietly that his lifestyle always seemed a few steps ahead of his actual income. Sana was different. She was sharp, ambitious, and she married a man named Faisal, an accountant who worked at a mid-sized firm in the city. Faisal was polite to my face, always calling me uncle with a respectful smile, but I had lived long enough to recognize a certain kind of politeness, the kind that exists only because it is useful, not because it is genuine. My wife, Nasreen, passed away 4 years ago. Heart failure, sudden, in her sleep. I do not like to dwell on that pain in this story, because some wounds are not meant for narration. They are meant to be carried quietly. But I will say this: after she died, something in our house changed. She had always been the emotional glue that held our family's respect for me in place. She was the one who would remind Sana gently, "Your father built everything you're standing on. Don't forget that." Without her voice in the house, I noticed, slowly, that voice disappearing from everyone else's mouths too. After her passing, Sana suggested that I move in with her and Faisal. "So you're not alone in that big house, Baba." I agreed. I sold nothing. I simply locked up my old house, the one I had built with my own hands over 12 years, and moved into their apartment on the third floor of a modern building in the city, into a small guest room that used to be a storage space. That was 2 years ago, and it was during those 2 years that I watched my daughter's respect for me erode, quietly, day by day, like water wearing down a stone, not through dramatic fights, through small comments, through tiny humiliations that individually seemed almost forgivable, but together painted a picture I could no longer ignore. It started with small things. "Baba, please don't leave your slippers in the hallway. Faisal's boss is coming over." Then it became, "Baba, can you eat dinner a little earlier? We're having guests and it looks odd having you at the table when they're here." Then it became something worse. One evening, I overheard Sana talking to her friend on the phone in the kitchen, not realizing I was standing just outside the door. "Honestly, it's like taking care of an extra child," she said, laughing softly. "He doesn't do anything all day, just sits with his old bank files and his tea. I keep telling Faisal, what exactly are we getting out of this arrangement?" I stood there, holding a glass of water, feeling something crack quietly inside my chest. Not anger, something closer to grief. I walked back to my room without saying anything. That night I opened my old steel almirah, the one piece of furniture I had insisted on bringing with me from my old house, and I took out a thin, water-stained passbook from the bottom drawer. It was from a small regional bank, the very first branch where I'd worked as a young clerk decades ago. On the cover, in faded blue ink, it simply said, R. Ahmed, Special Reserve Account. I ran my thumb over the cover and put it back exactly where it was. Some secrets are not meant to be revealed the moment you feel disrespected. Some secrets are meant to be revealed when the truth can do more good than your pride ever could. Over the following months, the disrespect did not stay subtle. It grew teeth. Faisal, my son-in-law, began speaking to me the way one speaks to an employee who has underperformed. "Uncle, please don't keep the AC on so long during the day. The electricity bill is getting out of hand." I wanted to remind him that I had spent 38 years working with numbers larger than he would see in his lifetime, and that I understood electricity bills better than most economics graduates. But I said nothing. I simply turned off the AC and sat with the window open, sweating through the humid afternoons, saying nothing. My son Bilal, meanwhile, would visit occasionally, always with some new business update that sounded impressive but never quite added up. "Baba, I need a small favor. My supplier is asking for advance payment, just 200,000. I'll return it within a month." I gave it to him the first time and the second. By the third time, I quietly stopped answering that specific request, and he stopped calling as often. Convenient. How love can be so closely tied to usefulness in some people's hearts. I want to describe, briefly, what an ordinary day looked like for me during those 2 years, because I think it matters for you to understand just how invisible a person can become inside their own family without a single dramatic incident ever occurring. I would wake at 5:30, out of decades of habit from my banking days, when early hours meant fewer people, quieter rooms, and time to think clearly before the noise of the world began. I would pray, then sit with a cup of tea by the small window in my room, watching the street below slowly wake up. The vegetable cart vendor arranging his produce, the milk delivery boy on his bicycle, the building security guard changing shift. Small, ordinary rituals that, strangely, gave me more peace during that period than almost anything else in my life. By 7, Sana would be rushing around getting ready for her job at a marketing firm, usually calling out instructions to Faisal about the children's school lunches, rarely acknowledging me beyond a quick, "Good morning, Baba," thrown over her shoulder, the kind of greeting one gives out of habit rather than presence. I did not resent this rush. I understood modern life demanded a pace mine never had to match at her age. What I noticed, though, was the absence of a follow-up. No. How did you sleep, Baba? No. Do you need anything from the market today? Just the morning rush, and then silence until dinner, if I was included in dinner at all. I filled my days quietly. I read newspapers cover to cover, the way I always had. I walked in the evenings, sometimes stopping at a small tea stall 2 streets away, where the owner, a young man named Iqbal, always greeted me with more warmth in 30 seconds than I sometimes received in my own home in a full day. I would sit there for 20 minutes sipping tea, talking about cricket scores or local news, and Iqbal would occasionally say something that stayed with me longer than it probably should have. "Uncle, you always seem so calm. Nothing ever bothers you?" And I would smile and say, "Everything bothers me, beta. I have just learned which battles are worth losing sleep over." Occasionally, I would help the children with their homework. Sana's 2 kids, my grandchildren, a boy of 9 named Hamza, and a girl of 6 named Anaya. They, at least, still treated me the way children treat grandparents who have not yet been reduced to inconvenience in their eyes, climbing onto my lap uninvited, asking me to tell stories about the olden days, genuinely delighted by my company in a way the adults around me had quietly stopped being. Hamza, in particular, loved when I told him about my early days walking to the bank because we couldn't afford bus fare, treating it like an adventure story rather than a hardship. Those moments, small as they were, kept something alive in me during a period when I might have otherwise felt entirely erased. But even those small joys came with their own quiet wounds. I remember one evening, Hamza asking me, with the innocent bluntness only children possess, "Dada, why do you always eat dinner after everyone else? Mama says it's because you like eating slow, but you eat fast when it's just us." I did not have a good answer for him that night. I simply said, "Sometimes grown-ups do things for reasons that are complicated, beta. When you're older, you'll understand." But internally, I understood exactly why. I ate after everyone else because Sana had quietly restructured mealtimes around my inconvenience rather than my inclusion, and I had allowed it because fighting over dinner timing felt beneath the dignity I was trying, however imperfectly, to preserve. The breaking point, or what I thought at the time was the breaking point, came on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. Sana had decided to clean out the guest room, my room, while I was out for my evening walk, something I did daily, partly for my health, partly because it was the only hour of the day I felt like a free man rather than a guest in someone else's house. When I returned, I found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by open boxes, sorting through old files, documents, and papers I had kept for decades. My heart sank the moment I saw the black garbage bag beside her, already half full. "Baba, you're back," she said, not even looking up. "I'm just clearing out some of this old stuff. It's taking up so much space, and half of it looks like expired paperwork anyway." I stepped closer, my chest tightening. "What exactly are you throwing away, beta?" "Old bank statements, some really outdated passbooks, receipts from like 20 years ago," she said, tossing another folder into the bag. "Honestly, I don't even know why you kept all this. It's just paper, Baba. None of these accounts are even active anymore, right?" I looked down and saw, peeking out from under a stack of yellowed receipts, the corner of a thin blue passbook, my special reserve account passbook, the one I had looked at just months earlier in my Elmira. Somehow, in the chaos of moving between houses, it had ended up mixed in with old, irrelevant paperwork. Every instinct in me wanted to snatch that bag away, to tell her exactly what she was about to throw into the trash. But something else, something quieter and more stubborn, held me back. I wanted to see, truly see, how far this disrespect would go if left unchecked. I wanted to know whether my daughter, the girl I had raised, fed, educated, and loved unconditionally, would even pause to ask me a single question before discarding a piece of my life. She did not pause. She tied the garbage bag, stood up, dusted off her hands, and said, "There, so much lighter in here now. You'll thank me later, Baba. Trust me." I said only one sentence. "You should always ask before throwing away someone else's things, Sana, even if you think they're worthless." She smiled, almost condescendingly, the way one smiles at a child who has said something outdated. "Baba, it's just old paper. Relax." I did not relax. I simply nodded, picked up my tea, which had gone cold on the windowsill, and walked into my room. I closed the door quietly. And for the first time since my wife's death, I sat on the edge of my bed and allowed myself exactly 3 minutes of grief. Not for the passbook, not for the money, but for the version of my daughter I remembered. The little girl who used to run to the door every evening shouting, "Baba's home." That girl felt very far away in that moment. But grief in my life has never been allowed to sit for long without purpose. By the time those 3 minutes passed, I had already made a decision. I picked up my phone and called an old friend, Tariq, a lawyer I had known since our university days, a man who had handled a few of my legal and financial matters quietly over the years, exactly the way I preferred things to be handled. Quietly. "Tariq, bye," I said. "I think it's time we activate the paperwork we discussed 2 years ago." There was a pause on the other end. Then Tariq's voice, careful and measured, the voice of a man who understood exactly the weight of what I was asking. "Are you sure, Rashid? Once we start this process, there's no quiet way to undo it. Everyone will know everything." I looked at my closed bedroom door, beyond which I could hear Sana laughing on the phone again, probably telling another friend how she had decluttered the guest room today. "I'm sure," I said. "It's time." What Sana did not know, what none of my children knew, was that the passbook she had just thrown into a garbage bag was not simply an outdated relic of a closed account. It was the key to something much, much larger, something that had been growing quietly, patiently, for nearly 4 decades, waiting for exactly the right moment to be revealed. You see, when I was 30 years old, still a junior officer climbing the ranks at my bank, a very unusual thing happened. An elderly client, a widower with no children of his own, a wealthy landowner named Haji Ghulam Sarwar, walked into my branch one afternoon needing help. He was suspicious of everyone around him, distant relatives circling like vultures, waiting for him to die so they could divide his property. He had heard, through mutual acquaintances, that there was one young bank officer who was known for being scrupulously honest, who had once returned an envelope of cash a customer had mistakenly left behind, uncounted, unopened, immediately. That honesty, small as it seemed to me at the time, became the foundation of a relationship that would change my entire life. Over the following 15 years, until his death, Haji Sarwar trusted me not just with his banking, but eventually with managing several of his properties, his agricultural land, and eventually structuring his will. He had no children, and he made a decision that stunned me at the time. He left a portion of his estate, structured carefully through legal trusts and specific accounts, to me. Not out of charity, out of respect. "You are the only person," he told me once, sitting in his courtyard under a neem tree, "who never once asked me for anything in 15 years. That is worth more to me than blood." I never touched that inheritance the way a man suddenly given wealth typically does. I did not buy a bigger house immediately. I did not change my lifestyle. I quietly, patiently invested it, some in commercial property in the city that was, at the time, undeveloped and cheap, some in long-term fixed accounts, and some in shares of a small manufacturing company that over the decades grew into something far larger than anyone could have predicted at the time. The passbook Sana threw away that Sunday afternoon was from the very first account Haji Sarwar had helped me open, a special reserve account linked to one of those original properties. It was not by itself worth a fortune anymore. The account had long since been consolidated into larger, more modern holdings, but it was the physical, legal thread, the original documentation, that connected my identity to a decades-old property trust that had, over the years, appreciated into something worth an amount that would make my son-in-law's electricity bill complaints look almost comical in hindsight. But even more importantly than the money itself, that passbook was proof. The original, notarized proof, of ownership that my lawyer, Tariq, had advised me for years to keep somewhere safe, precisely because certain distant relatives of Haji Sarwar had, over the decades, occasionally tried to contest portions of the estate in court, claiming fraud, claiming manipulation, claiming that a mere bank clerk could not possibly have earned such trust legitimately. For years, those claims had been quietly dismissed, case after case, because I always had the original documentation to prove the legitimacy of the transfer. And now that very documentation, thrown carelessly into a garbage bag by my own daughter who thought it was just old paper, was sitting somewhere in a landfill, or worse, in the hands of a garbage collector who had no idea what he was holding. That night, after speaking to Tariq, I did something I had never done before in my life. I lied to my daughter, not maliciously, strategically. "Sana," I called out, walking to the living room where she and Faisal were watching television. "That bag you threw out today, was it collected already, or is it still in the building's disposal area?" She glanced at Faisal, then back at me, her expression shifting slightly. Perhaps a flicker of concern that she had thrown away something important, but not quite serious enough to ask directly. "I think it's still downstairs, Baba. Why? Did you need something from it?" No, I said, waving my hand casually, forcing a calm I did not entirely feel. "I just wanted to check if my old reading glasses case was in there. I misplaced it earlier." "Oh," she said, relaxing immediately. "I'll check for you tomorrow morning before the collector comes." I nodded and walked away, my heart pounding harder than it had in years. That night, at nearly 11 p.m., wearing a simple kurta and slippers, I walked down 3 flights of stairs to the building's garbage disposal area, a small concrete room behind the parking lot, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. I felt for a moment almost absurd. A 68-year-old former bank executive digging through garbage bags in the middle of the night like a man searching for scraps. But dignity, I have learned in my life, is not about appearances. It is about what you protect and why. I found the bag. I found the passbook, slightly damp from a spilled tea bag someone else had thrown away, but intact, legible, salvageable. I held it in my hands under that flickering bulb and felt something between relief and quiet, cold resolve settle into my chest. I did not confront Sana that night. I did not tell her what she had almost destroyed. Instead, I walked back upstairs, wiped the passbook clean, placed it inside a fireproof folder I had Tariq couriered to me the very next morning, and I began, quietly, patiently, the process of finally revealing what I had spent 38 years building and protecting in silence. The following weeks unfolded slowly, deliberately, the way I have always preferred important things to unfold. I did not storm into the living room and announce my wealth like some dramatic movie scene. That is not who I am, and frankly, that is not how real family reckonings happen. Real reckonings happen through paperwork, through phone calls, through people slowly, uncomfortably realizing that the picture they had painted of someone was entirely, embarrassingly wrong. It began with a phone call that Faisal received on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting at the breakfast table, sipping tea, saying nothing, appearing, as always, like the quiet, slightly burdensome old man in the guest room. "Hello. Yes, this is Faisal. I'm sorry. Who is this regarding?" His voice shifted, becoming more formal, more careful. "A property dispute regarding Rashid Ahmed, my father-in-law." I did not look up from my tea. I simply listened, my expression unchanged as decades of careful strategy finally began to surface. "There's a law firm," Faisal said slowly, lowering the phone after the call ended, looking at Sana with visible confusion. asking about some kind of trust dispute. They mentioned Baba's name specifically. Something about a property inheritance case that's apparently being reopened. Sana turned to me. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and forced casualness. Baba, do you know anything about this? Is this related to your old bank job or something? I set my teacup down carefully. It might be, I said simply. Old cases sometimes resurface. Nothing to worry about. I could see it in her eyes. That particular kind of unease that comes when a person realizes there might be a piece of information they were never given, and that piece might be far larger than they previously assumed. But she did not push further that morning. Pride, I have noticed, often prevents people from asking direct questions when they suspect the answer might embarrass them. 2 days later, the second twist arrived, this time in the form of an actual visitor. A tall man in a formal gray suit arrived at the apartment on a Thursday afternoon, introducing himself politely at the door as Advocate Junaid, representing a law firm handling matters related to the estate of the late Haji Ghulam Sarwar. He asked very professionally whether Mr. Rashid Ahmed was available for a brief discussion regarding some updated documentation requirements. Sana, opening the door, looked utterly bewildered. I'm sorry, did you say Haji Ghulam Sarwar's estate? What does that have to do with my father? The lawyer smiled politely, the practiced smile of a man used to families discovering things about each other in real time. Perhaps it would be best if Mr. Ahmed explains that himself, ma'am. I'm simply here regarding some paperwork on his end. I walked to the door, greeted Advocate Junaid formally, and led him to sit in the small living room, while Sana and Faisal hovered awkwardly nearby, clearly trying to appear as though they were not desperately listening to every word. Mr. Ahmed, Junaid said, opening a leather folder. As you know, the Sarwar family's distant relatives have once again filed a partial claim regarding the commercial property in Gulberg, arguing the original 1994 trust documentation was improperly executed. We need the original notarized passbook linked to account 7734 to fully close this matter permanently in court next month. I felt Sana's eyes on me like twin spotlights. The passbook I threw away, she whispered, almost to herself, her face draining of color. I did not look at her immediately. I calmly reached into my room, retrieved the fireproof folder, and handed the passbook, now safely preserved, to Advocate Junaid. It's here, Junaid, fully intact. Junaid examined it briefly, nodded with visible relief, and said something that, I will admit, I had privately hoped he would say in front of exactly this audience. This is excellent, Mr. Ahmed. With this, the Gulberg Commercial Plaza, the agricultural land in Sheikhupura, and the 3 residential properties held under the Sarwar Family Trust remain permanently secured under your name, as originally intended by the late Haji Sahab. This closes the matter entirely. The room went silent. I mean truly, completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on a room like humidity before a storm. Faisal was the first to speak, his voice unusually thin. Uncle, the Gulberg Commercial Plaza, the one near the main boulevard, that's worth... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room, including myself, understood the number he was too stunned to say out loud. Sana sat down slowly on the arm of the sofa, staring at me as though seeing me for the first time in her entire life. Baba, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, you own all of that? I looked at her, calm, steady, the way I have always tried to remain regardless of the storm around me. I've owned it for a long time, Beta. I simply never saw the need to discuss it. Advocate Junaid, sensing the emotional weight settling into the room, gathered his papers, thanked me formally, and excused himself, promising to follow up regarding the final court date the following month. The moment the door closed behind him, The apartment felt like it belonged to a different family entirely. Sana turned to me immediately, her earlier condescension replaced with something raw and unfiltered. "Why didn't you tell us, Baba? All this time we thought—" She stopped herself. "You thought what exactly?" I asked, my voice calm but not without an edge of quiet challenge. She looked down, unable to finish the sentence, but I finished it for her, gently, without cruelty, because even in that moment, my intention was never to humiliate her the way I had been humiliated. "You thought I was a burden, an old man taking up space, eating your food, using your electricity, with nothing left to contribute except old paperwork you assumed was garbage. Baba, that's not—" She started, but her voice cracked, and she stopped again. "It's exactly that, Sana," I said, still calm, still gentle, but firm. "I heard you on the phone with your friend months ago. I heard what you called me." Her face went pale. Faisal shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly realizing he too had said things, made comments about electricity and AC usage and inconvenience that suddenly felt profoundly, embarrassingly small in light of what had just been revealed. I did not shout. I did not list every grievance. I simply stood up, walked to my room, and said one final thing before closing the door quietly behind me. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to see who you would be toward me without knowing. That was the real test, Sana, not the passbook. You." I will admit, that night was one of the most emotionally exhausting nights of my life, more exhausting in some ways than the day I had buried my wife. Grief for a spouse, though devastating, is at least clean in its sorrow. You know exactly what you have lost. But watching your own child realize, in real time, that her disrespect had been building for months, watching the shame flood her face, was a different, more complicated kind of pain. Because even in my hurt, even in the quiet satisfaction of being vindicated, I did not want to see her broken. I wanted her to learn. Those are two very different things, and holding both at once is exhausting. Word, of course, does not stay contained within four walls for long, especially in families where relatives thrive on information like oxygen. By the following week, my son Bilal had heard everything, likely through some cousin who had heard it from Faisal's mother, who had heard it from Faisal himself in a moment of stunned oversharing. Bilal called me on a Sunday morning, his voice unusually careful, stripped of its usual loud confidence. "Baba, I heard about the Goldberg property. Is it true?" "It's true," I said simply. There was a long pause. "Baba, why didn't you ever tell me? All those times I asked you for help with my business, you could have just—" "Could have just what, Bilal?" I interrupted, my voice steady. "Handed you money without you ever learning to build something yourself? Money that came, not from me, but from someone else's trust in my character? Would that have taught you anything? Or would it have simply taught you that struggle is optional if you complain to your father enough?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I just feel stupid, Baba. All this time we thought you were struggling. Some of us even joked that you'd probably end up needing Sana and Faisal to take care of you permanently because you had nothing saved." Hearing that confirmed out loud, so plainly, so casually, hurt more than I expected it to, even after everything. "I know," I said quietly. "I heard those jokes too, in different forms, over the past 2 years." "I'm sorry, Baba," Bilal said, and for the first time in a long time, his voice sounded genuinely, uncomfortably sincere, not performative. "I really am." I did not immediately forgive him in that conversation, not because I wanted to hold on to anger, but because I have learned over 68 years that immediate forgiveness often teaches people that consequences are optional if the apology sounds good enough. I told him simply, "We'll talk properly when you visit, not on the phone." Before I tell you about the third major twist, I want to take a moment to describe something that happened in between. A smaller moment, not a legal reveal, not a courtroom drama, but a quiet domestic incident that in hindsight told me more about the true state of my family than any lawyer's phone call ever could. It was a Friday evening, about 10 days after the Goldberg property revelation. Sana had invited some relatives over for dinner, her husband's older sister Rukhsana, and Rukhsana's husband, a retired army officer named Colonel Aslam, along with their son, a young man in his 20s who was, from what I understood, recently returned from studying abroad and now figuring out his next steps, which is a polite family phrase for unemployed. I was not initially invited to sit at the main table. This was not new. For the past 2 years, whenever Sana hosted guests she considered important, I was usually served a plate in my room, with some gentle excuse about not wanting to overwhelm you with the noise, Baba. I had accepted this arrangement without complaint, partly out of genuine preference for quiet, and partly because I had long stopped expecting to be centered in my own daughter's social life. But that evening was different. Word of the Goldberg case had clearly spread through the extended family faster than I anticipated, likely through Faisal's mother, who treated family gossip the way a newspaper treats breaking news. When Colonel Aslam arrived and saw me sitting quietly in the living room with a book, his entire demeanor shifted. "Rashid Sahab," he said, extending both hands warmly, a gesture he had never once offered me in the 3 previous times we had met. "I had no idea you were the same Rashid Ahmed connected to the Sarwar Trust matter. My cousin's husband is actually a junior clerk at the same court handling your case. Small world, isn't it?" I smiled politely, saying little, while I noticed, from the corner of my eye, Sana's expression shift rapidly from mild embarrassment to something closer to performance. "Baba, please, come sit at the main table tonight," she said quickly, practically pulling the chair out for me herself. I should have insisted earlier. I sat because refusing would have created its own unnecessary scene, but I noted, quietly, internally, the timing of this sudden inclusion. 2 years of separate plates in a guest room, and it took one lawyer's phone call to earn myself a seat at my own daughter's dinner table. Throughout that dinner, Colonel Aslam asked me question after question about the property, about Haji Sarwar, about my brilliant foresight, his tone dripping with a kind of respect that felt less like genuine curiosity and more like a man recalculating my social value in real time. His son, previously uninterested in anything beyond his phone screen, suddenly asked me detailed questions about property investment, clearly hoping I might offer some casual advice, or worse, some casual money. I answered politely, briefly, offering no specifics about numbers, no promises of assistance. But what struck me most that evening was not the colonel's sudden warmth, or his son's transparent curiosity. It was watching Sana, throughout the entire meal, glance at me every few minutes with an expression I can only describe as anxious pride. Proud to have a father suddenly deemed impressive by her in-laws, yet anxious, I suspect, about what that pride revealed about her own prior behavior. After the guests left that night, she lingered in the kitchen while I sat at the dining table, finishing the last of my tea. "Baba," she said, not quite looking at me directly, "I noticed how differently everyone treated you tonight compared to before." "I noticed too," I said simply. "Does that bother you? That people are suddenly nicer because of money?" I considered the question honestly before answering. "It bothers me less than it saddens me," I said. "Money reveals things about people faster than almost anything else in life. Some people become kinder because their curiosity is genuine. Others become kinder because their calculations changed. The difficult part, Sana, is learning to tell the difference, and realizing that the people who were kind to you before they knew what you had are usually the only kindness worth trusting." She was quiet for a long moment, drying a teacup slowly, methodically, clearly turning that sentence over in her mind. Was I one of the ones whose calculations changed, Baba? Or was I always unkind, even before any of this? It was perhaps the most honest question she had asked me in the entire ordeal, and I owed her an equally honest answer. "You weren't unkind as a child, Sana. You were unkind for about 2 years during a period when grief made me quiet and your own life made you busy, and somewhere in that gap, you simply stopped looking closely enough to notice the difference between a father who had nothing left to offer and a father who was simply choosing for his own private reasons not to perform his worth out loud. That is not the same as being unkind by nature, but it is still worth being honest about, so it never happens again, to me or to anyone else in your life who might one day go quiet without you fully understanding why." She did not respond immediately. She simply nodded, placed the last teacup back into the cabinet, and before leaving the kitchen, walked over and kissed the top of my head, the way I used to kiss hers when she was small enough to carry to bed. It was a small gesture, but after 2 years of quiet distance, it felt like the beginning of something being genuinely rebuilt, rather than merely performed. The third major twist, the one that truly reshaped how my family understood the past 2 years, arrived almost accidentally, through Tariq, my lawyer, during a routine visit to finalize the Gulberg matter. We were sitting in my room, reviewing final paperwork, when Tariq mentioned, almost in passing, "You know, Rashid, it's remarkable timing that this case resurfaced now. If it had happened even 8 months ago, before you'd moved documentation of the Sheikhupura land into the updated trust structure, things could have gotten complicated. Good thing you insisted on redoing all of that after Nasreen passed." Sana, who happened to be walking past my open door with a tray of tea, stopped mid-step. "Redoing what exactly?" Tariq glanced at me, unsure whether he had spoken out of turn. I simply nodded, giving him permission to continue, because I had already decided, after the Gulberg reveal, that half-truths and slow reveals had served their purpose, and full honesty was now the more useful path forward. "After your mother passed away," Tariq explained gently, "your father restructured almost everything, the trust, the properties, even his personal accounts, specifically to ensure that, regardless of what happened to him, all 3 of his properties, his savings, and this apartment complex's original construction loan, which he had actually co-financed years ago as an investment, would be protected and eventually passed to you and Bilal fairly, without dispute, without complication, without any of you having to go through lawyers and courts the way distant relatives of Haji Sahab have been forced to for decades." Sana's hand trembled slightly, the tea tray shifting. "Wait," she said slowly. "You said this apartment complex. Baba, do you mean this building? The one Faisal and I live in?" I finally spoke, my voice quieter now, the performance of calm strategy giving way to something more genuinely tired, more human. "Yes, Sana. 15 years ago, I invested in the early construction of this residential complex, back when it was just an empty plot and a group of ambitious young developers with more vision than capital. I never told you, because when you and Faisal decided to rent an apartment here after your marriage, purely by coincidence in a building I had partial ownership in, I thought it would be amusing, honestly, to simply watch how things unfolded without revealing that connection." "You own part of this building?" Faisal's voice came from the doorway now, too, his face somewhere between shock and visible embarrassment, likely recalling every complaint he had ever made about rent increases, about maintenance fees, about the landlord's unreasonable policies. "A significant part, yes," I said simply, "which is partly why I agreed so easily when you suggested I move in here after Nasreen's death, Sana. I was curious to see this building from the inside, as a resident, not just as a name on ownership documents." The silence that followed was, once again, heavy, layered with 100 unspoken realizations rearranging themselves in real time across their faces. I want to pause here, in telling this story, and be honest about something important. I did not orchestrate any of this out of a desire for revenge. If revenge had been my goal, I could have simply hired a different lawyer, quietly evicted them under some clause, and let the humiliation cut far deeper than words ever could. I never once considered that. My goal, if I truly examined my own heart during those months, was simpler and sadder than revenge. I wanted to know if my children loved me or if they loved what they assumed I could no longer provide. That distinction matters more than most people realize until they are forced, like I was, to test it. The days following the apartment building revelation were strange in our household. Quiet, careful, filled with a kind of cautious respect that felt almost performative at first, as though Sana and Faisal were suddenly terrified of saying the wrong thing to a man they now realized held more power over their lives than they had ever imagined. I did not want that either. Fear-based respect is, in some ways, almost as hollow as the disrespect that preceded it. One evening, about 3 weeks after the building revelation, Sana knocked on my door, something she rarely did without an obvious reason attached. "Baba, can I talk to you? Just talk. Not about property, not about money." I gestured for her to sit on the small chair across from my bed. She sat, hands folded tightly in her lap, looking for a moment exactly like she had at 8 years old, waiting nervously to confess she had broken something in the house. "I keep thinking about the passbook," she said quietly. "Not because of what it turned out to be worth, because of how easily I threw it away without asking you a single question. What does that say about the kind of daughter I've become, Baba?" I considered my answer carefully, because I sensed this was the real conversation, the one beneath all the legal paperwork and shocked reveals. "It says," I said slowly, "that somewhere in the last few years, you stopped seeing me as a person with a history and started seeing me only as a responsibility. A guest room to manage, an electricity bill to monitor. That's not entirely your fault, Sana. After your mother died, I withdrew too. I stopped talking about my past, my work, my life before you were born. I let myself become smaller in this house because grief made me quiet. And quiet, apparently, gets mistaken for empty." Tears formed in her eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them. "I called you a burden, Baba, to my friend. I actually said those words." "I know," I said gently. "I heard you." "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't even know how to fix something like that." I reached over and took her hand, something I had not done in longer than I cared to admit. "You fix it," I said, not with one apology, but with 100 small corrections, every single day, the same way disrespect built up, slowly, quietly, until it became a habit. Respect has to become a habit too, Sana. Not a performance because you're afraid of what I own, a genuine habit because you remember who I actually am." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, I felt something in our relationship shift back toward the direction it had once been, back when she was small enough to sit on my shoulders at the Sunday bazaar, laughing every time I pretended to lose my balance. Bilal's reckoning took a different, more practical shape. He visited 2 weeks later, not with his usual loud energy, but quieter, more deliberate. He sat across from me at the small dining table, and instead of asking for anything, for once he simply said, "Baba, I want to actually understand the business you built with Haji Sahab's trust, not to ask for money, to learn how you did it, properly, this time." I spent the next several hours explaining, patiently, the way I once explained banking fundamentals to junior clerks decades earlier, how patience compounds faster than impulsiveness, how trust, once earned honestly, becomes more valuable than any single transaction, how real wealth is built through decades of unglamorous discipline, not flashy risks disguised as ambition. For the first time in years, my son looked at me not as a source of funds, but as a source of knowledge. That shift, small as it might sound to an outside observer, felt to me like one of the most significant victories of this entire ordeal. The final court hearing regarding the Gulberg property dispute took place about 6 weeks after that first fateful phone call. I asked Sana and Faisal to accompany me, not because I needed their support legally, but because I wanted them to witness firsthand the full weight of what had almost been discarded so carelessly. The courtroom was formal, restrained, nothing like the dramatic legal battles shown in films. Advocate Junaid presented the original 1994 documentation alongside the passbook, my passbook, the one nearly lost forever in a garbage bag, as definitive proof of the legitimate trust established by the late Haji Ghulam Sarwar decades earlier. The distant relatives, represented by their own lawyer, offered weak, largely circumstantial objections that the judge dismissed within the hour. "The court finds," the judge stated plainly, "that the trust structure and subsequent property transfers to Mr. Rashid Ahmed, established legally in 1994 and consistently maintained through proper documentation over the following decades, remain fully valid. This matter is permanently closed." As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Sana walked closer to me than she had in months, slipping her hand into mine, the way she used to as a little girl crossing a busy street. "Baba," she said softly, "I know I can't undo what I said or what I almost threw away, but I promise you from today, you'll never have to wonder again whether we see you for who you really are." I squeezed her hand gently, feeling, for the first time in a long while, something close to peace settle over the ache that had lived quietly in my chest since Nasreen's passing. "I don't need grand promises, Beta," I said. "I just need small, honest days. That's all real respect has ever needed from anyone. There is one more twist I have not yet told you, and I have saved it for last, because it is the one that taught me the most about my son, and about the difference between a man who fails honestly and a man who hides his failures out of pride. About 2 months after the Goldberg case closed, Bilal came to me one evening, not with his usual confidence, but with the posture of a man carrying something heavy he could no longer hold alone. He sat across from me at my dining table. I had by then already begun preparing to move back into my own house, though the process was slow, deliberate, filled with small sentimental decisions about which room to reopen first. "Baba," he said, staring at his hands rather than at me, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I nodded, folding my hands calmly, bracing myself for whatever confession was coming. "The import-export business," he said slowly. "It's not what I told everyone it was. It hasn't been profitable in almost 2 years. I've been borrowing from 3 different people to cover losses, telling each of them I'd pay them back from incoming shipments that don't actually exist anymore. I owe almost 4 million rupees, Baba. I've been terrified for months, and every time I asked you for money, it wasn't for supplier advances. It was to stop the whole thing from collapsing publicly." I sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing not the number, which, given what I now possessed, was manageable, but the weight of what he had just admitted, that his confident exterior, the very same confidence that had made him the golden child in every family gathering for years, had been a performance covering genuine desperation. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier, Bilal? Before it became 4 million rupees instead of 400,000. His eyes finally met mine, wet, exhausted. "Because I was ashamed, Baba. You built everything from nothing. Dignity, patience, discipline, that's your whole identity. And I couldn't even keep a business afloat that I inherited every advantage to run successfully. I thought admitting failure to you would prove every quiet judgment I imagined you were making about me." I felt something in my chest soften because I recognized painfully a version of my own fear reflected back at me. The fear of being seen as less than what people expected. The very fear that had kept me silent about my wealth for 2 years inside this very family. "Bilal," I said quietly, "silence protects pride, but it destroys trust. I know this better than almost anyone alive, because I did exactly what you just did, for different reasons, for 2 years in this very apartment. I let all of you believe I was a burden rather than admit the truth, because some part of me wanted to test you rather than simply trust you. And you let all of us believe you were thriving rather than admit failure, because some part of you feared losing our respect. We are, in a strange way, far more alike than either of us wanted to admit." He wiped his eyes, something he rarely allowed himself to do in front of me. "What happens now, Baba?" Now, I said, you sit with me every single day for the next month and we go through every rupee of that business. Honestly, completely, without pride getting in the way. I will help you close what needs closing, restructure what can be saved, and pay off what must be paid off. But not as a gift, Bilal. As a loan, properly documented, with actual terms, actual accountability, the same way I would have handled any serious client at the bank 40 years ago. Because the last thing I want to give you is another easy escape that teaches you nothing. He agreed immediately, almost desperately. And over the following weeks, I watched my son do something I had never seen him do before. Sit quietly, take notes, ask clarifying questions, admit when he did not understand something instead of pretending confidence he did not feel. We closed the failing import contracts, salvaged a smaller, more sustainable trading arrangement with 2 reliable local clients, and structured a real repayment plan that, 3 years later as I tell you this story, he has honored every single month without fail. That, to me, remains one of the quieter, less dramatic twists of this entire experience, but perhaps the most meaningful one. Because property disputes and courtroom victories make for exciting turns in a story, but watching your son finally choose honesty over pride in a private conversation nobody outside our family will ever hear about is the kind of twist that actually changes a person's character permanently. In the months that followed, life in our household did not transform into some unrealistic, perfectly harmonious fantasy. That is not how real families heal, and frankly, I would distrust any story that claimed otherwise. Faisal remained at times a man more comfortable with numbers than emotional conversations, but he began, slowly, asking me genuine questions about my past work, my decisions, my life before I became simply uncle in the guest room. Bilal restructured his business with actual discipline for the first time, occasionally calling me not for money but for advice, which to a father is a far more valuable phone call to receive. I eventually moved back into my own house, the one I had built with my own hands over 12 years, room by room, not out of resentment toward Sana and Faisal, but because after everything I realized I no longer needed to prove anything by staying somewhere I felt unseen. Sana visits every single Sunday now, without exception, often bringing her children, my grandchildren, to sit with me on the veranda I built myself decades ago. The same veranda where I used to sit as a young father, dreaming about a future none of them could have possibly imagined at the time. Sometimes in the quiet of an evening, Sana will ask me to tell her stories about Haji Sarwar, about the early days at the bank, about the decades of quiet discipline that built everything we now sit inside, literally and figuratively. And I tell her, patiently, the same way I once explained things to junior clerks, the same way I once tried to explain things to my own children before grief and misunderstanding briefly clouded our home. I do not tell this story to boast about property or wealth. Anyone who reduces this story to numbers has missed its entire point. I tell this story because somewhere, right now, there is likely another quiet father, sitting in a guest room somewhere, being spoken about in hushed, dismissive tones by people who assume silence means emptiness. I want that father, wherever he is, to know something important. Silence is not surrender. Patience is not weakness. And sometimes the most ordinary-looking piece of paper in your hands carries a history far heavier than the people around you could ever imagine. My daughter learned that lesson the day she threw away an old water-stained passbook, thinking it was worthless junk cluttering up a guest room. What she almost destroyed was not paper. It was proof of 38 years of quiet discipline, of one honest young clerk who returned an envelope of cash instead of stealing it, of a friendship built entirely on integrity between 2 men who had nothing in common except their respect for honesty. I am 68 years old now. I have buried my wife, weathered my children's doubts about my worth, and survived the particular loneliness of being underestimated inside my own family. But I am still here, still calm, still the same quiet man who believes that dignity is not something you announce loudly. It is something you protect patiently and reveal only when the truth can finally do more good than your pride ever could. And if there is one thing I hope every person listening to this story remembers, it is simply this. Before you throw away what looks like an old man's useless clutter, ask him what it means to him first. You might just be holding a piece of history far too valuable to lose. Let me tell you how things stand now, a little over 3 years after that Sunday afternoon when a garbage bag nearly swallowed 38 years of my life. My house, the one I built brick by brick, room by room over 12 patient years, is full again. Not with grandeur, not with anything a stranger walking past would find remarkable, but full in the way that matters most. Full of people who choose to be there, not because they need something from me, but because they want to sit on the same veranda where I once sat as a young father, with more dreams than money. Every Sunday, without exception, Sana arrives around 10 in the morning, usually with Hamza and Anaya trailing behind her, both of them now old enough to help me water the small guava tree I planted the year Hamza was born. Faisal comes too, and something in him has genuinely shifted. He no longer speaks to me in the careful transactional tone of a man managing a household expense. Last month, without me asking, he sat with me for 2 hours going through my old bank ledgers, not out of curiosity about numbers, but because he said quietly, "I want to understand the man my children call Dada, not just the man who happens to own things." Bilal's business, restructured and rebuilt on honest footing, now operates on a modest but sustainable scale. He still calls me every Thursday evening, sometimes for advice, sometimes just to talk. And last winter, when his smaller venture secured its first genuinely profitable contract without any help from me beyond guidance, he drove 2 hours just to tell me in person rather than over the phone. He stood at my door, grinning like the boy he used to be before pride and desperation aged him prematurely, and said, "Baba, I did this one myself. Actually, myself." I have rarely felt prouder of anything in my life, including the properties, including the courtroom victory, including all 38 years of quiet discipline that built everything else. I think often about Advocate Junaid's visit that Thursday afternoon, the one that unraveled everything so quickly, and I wonder sometimes what would have happened if that phone call had come a week later, after the garbage truck had already collected that bag, after the passbook had been lost forever in some landfill outside the city. Tariq tells me, honestly, that we likely would have found another way to prove the trust's legitimacy eventually, through older bank records, through Haji Sarwar's original notary, through months of expensive, exhausting legal reconstruction. But something tells me the timing of that near loss mattered for reasons beyond the legal paperwork. It mattered because it forced a reckoning that might have taken years longer to arrive naturally, if it arrived at all. I do not know if Sana still remembers, word for word, what she said to her friend on that phone call months before the passbook incident. I have never brought it up again since our conversation in the kitchen, because some wounds, once acknowledged honestly, do not need to be reopened repeatedly to prove they have healed. What I do know is that respect, once truly rebuilt, announces itself in small, unglamorous ways far more convincingly than any single dramatic apology ever could. It announces itself in Sana calling simply to ask how I slept. It announces itself in Faisal turning off his own phone during dinner so I have his full attention while telling an old story about the bank. It announces itself in Hamza now correcting his younger cousins when they interrupt me mid-sentence, saying, with a seriousness that makes me smile every time, "You have to let Dada finish, he's telling us something important." Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on my veranda alone, exactly where I used to sit as a young man dreaming about a future none of my family could have imagined. And I think about Haji Ghulam Sarwar, the old widower who trusted a young, unremarkable bank clerk simply because that clerk never once asked him for anything. I think about how strange it is that the same quality, quiet integrity, patient honesty, the refusal to perform value for the sake of being noticed, nearly cost me my family's respect, and ultimately became the very thing that restored it. I do not tell young fathers who ask me for advice these days to hide their worth the way I did. That was never really a strategy. It was more a consequence of grief and pride tangled together in a way I am not entirely proud of, even now. What I tell them instead is simpler. Speak up before silence becomes a habit that outlives its usefulness. Tell your children what you have sacrificed, not to be praised for it, but so they understand the weight of what they are standing on. I stayed silent far longer than I needed to, and while the ending of my story turned out well, I carry, quietly, the awareness that it did not have to take a near loss, a lawyer's phone call, and a courtroom to arrive at a truth that honest conversation could have reached far sooner, with far less pain for everyone involved. But we do not always get to choose the paths our families take toward understanding each other. Sometimes it takes an old passbook, thrown carelessly into a garbage bag on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, to remind everyone involved that the quiet people in a room are often carrying more history, more sacrifice, and more quiet strength than anyone bothered to ask about. If you are the quiet one in your family right now, the parent whose contributions go unnoticed, the grandparent treated as a guest in a home you helped build, the elder whose silence is mistaken for emptiness, I want you to know that your dignity does not require an inheritance, a courtroom, or a dramatic reveal to be valid. It only requires you to keep believing, patiently, that the truth of who you are does not depend on who else chooses to see it. And if you are the child, the son-in-law, the daughter-in-law, the one who has perhaps grown a little too comfortable dismissing the quiet elder in your own home, ask him about the old papers before you throw them away. Ask her about the worn photograph before you decide it is clutter. You might discover nothing more than sentimental memories, and that alone would be worth the asking. Or you might discover, as my daughter did on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, that you were standing far closer to a lifetime of sacrifice than you ever bothered to notice.